This is the lecture for Key Issue 2 for Ethnicity, Chapter 7. Why do ethnicities have distinctive distributions? Let's talk about international migration of some of the dominant ethnicities of the United States. Most African Americans are descended from Africans forced to migrate to Western Hemisphere as slaves during the 18th century. So remember when we talked about different forms of or different types of migration, forced and voluntary. This, of course, is forced. Most Asian Americans and Hispanics are descended from voluntary immigrants to the United States during the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Let's go back to the international migration, forced migration from Africa. Different European countries acquired slaves from various regions of Africa and sent them to the Americas. This is a picture that I took in Cape Coast Castle. It's not really the kind of castle that we think of, but that's what it's called. But in actuality, it's a slave fort. And this is where slaves would be brought to be put on slave vessels known as slavers. Ships that would take them across the Atlantic. If you have any questions about that, I'm more than happy to talk about it. But for the purposes of this class, here's what we need to know. European powers obtained slaves primarily from a narrow strip along the west coast of Africa, from Liberia to Angola. First, Africans were brought to Jamestown, Virginia in 1619 on a Dutch ship. For the next 200 years, roughly 400,000 were brought in. By 1808, slavery was banned. Well, slavery wasn't banned, but the slave trade was banned. But it is believed that another 250,000 came illegally. This shows the British, well, not the British, but what's known as the triangular slave trade pattern, which the British initiated in the 18th century. And what you see here are just some basic examples of goods that would have moved back and forth. And of course, human slaves as well. But there are other examples. But the general idea is that manufactured goods, cloth, trinkets, liquor, and of course guns would be brought from Europe down to Western Africa. They would be traded for African slaves through African traders, and those slaves would be loaded up on ships, taken across the Atlantic. Most were taken to the Caribbean, where they would then be traded or sold again. And some of those Caribbean ships would head back to Europe with things like molasses and sugarcane, and then others yet would be taken to North America as well as South America, and things like tobacco, rum, cotton later on would be taken to Europe. Let's talk about voluntary migration from Latin America and Asia. Immigration from Mexico and Puerto Rico fueled rapid growth of Hispanics in the United States beginning in the 1970s. The third largest group of Hispanics came to the United States from Cuba. Asia also began increasing, I don't want to say Asia began increasing as if it was a concerted effort, but an increasing number of immigrants started coming to the United States from Asia around the 70s as well. And the ranking of sending countries, this isn't that important, but what I do want you to know is that India and China are way ahead of the pack, ahead of these other ones. Until recently, it was China that was the number one ranked sender out of the Asian countries, but India recently has moved past it. They're very close together though. And then of course you have the Philippines, Korea, and Vietnam. When we're looking at a list like this, we have to wonder, why is it these countries? And it's likely that you will remember when we studied immigration, we talked about how people have to have a reason to go. They have to have push factors, but they also have to have means. They have to have the ability. And these are countries where at least a number of people do have the ability, they have the education, and they have the funds to actually move. In countries as big as India and China, certainly you have many poor people, but you also have many people who are highly educated and have enough money to travel internationally and migrate internationally. The Philippines has a history of connection with the United States. You can ask your history teacher about that if you like, or ask me. Korea, similar story. Well, I shouldn't say similar story, but similar reason. And the Korean War kind of solidified our relationship with South Korea. Similar situation resulted in our relationship with Vietnam. There's something about war that seems to bring the United States together with other countries. Here's the top metropolitan destinations for Asian immigrants in the United States. We already looked at the distribution of ethnicities within the U.S., but I just thought I'd throw this in as well, as it is pretty updated. I guess it's a few years old. But what it's showing you, of course, is many Asian Americans reside on the West Coast, which is no surprise, but there are many across the country as they've been spreading out from the West Coast to big cities. And of course, the largest concentration other than the West Coast will be the Northeast, simply because of the size of those cities. But you'll notice Texas, even parts of the Deep South, of course Atlanta and Nashville are going to have a lot, but Memphis is right up there as well. Internal migration of African Americans. African Americans have displayed two distinct internal migration patterns in the United States during the 20th century, and they're distinct compared to the migration patterns of whites. The first one is interregional migration from the U.S. South to northern cities during the first half of the 20th century. The second one is intraregional, from inner city ghettos to outer city and inner city suburban neighborhoods during the second half of the 20th century. Let's look at that interregional migration. After African Americans were freed from slavery, and in many ways freed themselves from slavery, most African Americans remained in the rural South during the late 19th century, working as sharecroppers. Now, sharecroppers, one of your vocab terms, people who work fields rented from a landowner and have to pay rent by turning over a share of the crops to him or her. Not a very good deal for the person doing all the work, and indeed this is how much of the South operated. The majority of farmers in the South during this time, both white and black, were sharecroppers. Mechanization of agriculture, which is the increased use of machinery for agricultural work, served as a push factor, because if your job is getting replaced by a machine, you got to go find another job. While manufacturing jobs in the North acted as a pull factor that encouraged African Americans to migrate to the northern cities. Another reason for this is evident if you study African American history, and that is that African Americans felt like they would be safer in the North rather than continuing to live in the South where lynchings were common and abuse was widespread. Here you have a picture of a tenant farmer in the Old South. This shows migration of African Americans and how it followed four distinctive channels along the East Coast, the East Central, the West Central, and the Southwest regions of the country. African Americans loaded up everything they had into cars, drove on two-lane highways, and headed north and headed west. There's an old Langston Hughes poem, and I don't remember the name of it, but it basically tells his people to head north and head west anywhere but south. African Americans arriving at northern cities clustered in neighborhoods where existing African Americans already lived. This is a familiar concept to us. It's the idea of chain migration. African Americans lived in these areas, and they came to be known as ghettos. And a ghetto really is just an enclave where one particular ethnicity lives. And it's a very negative term, a pejorative term now, but that's the idea behind it, is that a particular ethnicity lives in a particular neighborhood. Over time, ghettos grew outward, typically along major avenues that radiated out from the center of the city. Many whites fled their neighborhoods when blacks began moving in nearby. This, unfortunately, is a fact of American history in the 20th century and in the 21st century, although I feel like this is in decline. I shouldn't say I feel like, I know this to be a fact. You have a lot of younger people more willing to move into the city rather than trying to move out to the suburbs. They want the excitement and the diversity of city life, and so I'm optimistic that we are seeing a decline in what's known as white flight, but it does still occur, and we've seen it in Memphis. There was a time when most whites lived within the city, but we know that they, over the last few decades, have moved out of the center of the city, moved out to places like Fraser and Whitehaven, and then as blacks also moved out, whites moved out of those places and filled up places like Germantown and Collierville and Cordova and Bartlett, and some of those places they've even moved out of, and you can find a direct connection to the increase in buildings and businesses in places like South Haven and Olive Branch because of this. Now, I'm not saying all of that movement is white flight. Some people just want a bigger house in a safer neighborhood and a bigger yard and nicer schools, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. But this is a reality, and the term that you have looked at before, known as a block busting, is associated with this, and that is when realtors try to convince people to sell their whites to sell their homes rapidly for less than they would like, because they instill in them a fear that they're not going to be able to sell their home if more African Americans move into the neighborhood. So an example of this white flight that is well known is in Detroit, when the white population of that city dropped by 1.5 million in the 5 decades between 1950 and 2000. And that's quite a bit. So you can see that visually represented here, where you have the change in Detroit's population over time. And as the African American population steadily increases and really levels off in the 70s and 80s, 90s, and actually starts to decline a little bit in the 2010s, you see the white population drop rapidly starting in the 1950s. Now, Detroit's decline is not just because of white flight, and certainly white flight has played a role in its decline because of the unfair but true fact that most wealth is in a city is held by white people and white businessmen and women. And when they leave, they take much of that wealth with them. They take those taxes with them. They take a great degree of business activity with them. And that is part of the decline of a city like Detroit. But another part of the decline is the overall decline in manufacturing. Detroit was a major manufacturing hub, and as a great deal of manufacturing has moved overseas to places like Asia and south to places like Mexico, where there's cheaper labor, we've seen a decline in the number of jobs and the number of businesses to support a city like Detroit. I want to talk about some of the segregation that has occurred in the US and abroad as it relates to ethnicity. The first thing that we'll talk about is a very important Supreme Court case, which is Plessy versus Ferguson. The Supreme Court upheld a Louisiana law that required blacks and whites to ride in separate railway cars. States that and Plessy versus Ferguson stated that the law was constitutional because it provided separate but equal treatment of blacks and whites. Now, we know, with hindsight being what it is, that you really can't have equal treatment if you have separate treatment. Southern states enacted a set of laws commonly referred to as the Jim Crow laws to segregate blacks from whites. And this Supreme Court ruling had a major effect in making Southern states feel like they had the legal right to do that. Blacks, for example, blacks had to sit in the backs of buses, and shops, restaurants, and hotels could choose to serve only whites. And indeed, many of them did. Familiar scene would be having a sign depicting where whites and coloreds use the restroom, or two different water fountains, or two different places to sit. Arguably, an even more extreme form of segregation could be found in South Africa, and certainly for much later. And this was known as apartheid. White descendants from Holland, as well as Great Britain, had been living in South Africa for multiple generations and had assumed most of the control over, almost all of the control over the country. And they enacted a legal system intended to segregate its people, called apartheid, which means apartness. It's a physical separation of different races into different geographic areas. But it went so much further than just physical separation. Apartheid meant that depending on your color, whether you were mixed, whether you were black, whether you were white, whether you were Asian, the government could tell you who you could marry, where you could live, where you could go to school. It put major limits on people's ability to achieve, certainly people of color. The laws were not repealed until 1991. And while many gains have been made since then, and a great deal of political power has been achieved and attained by black Africans in South Africa, there is still a lot of turmoil surrounding race, and there's still a great disparity in wealth between white South Africans and black ones. Okay, that is it. We are finished. We are done, and it's time to get out of here. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, you can look back over Key Issue 2 in your book, and it's time to start reading Key Issue 3 when you get the chance.